Hey all, I'm Sasha Weiss, and this is my end of quarter summary for the Context-Aware Microreminders project, which I'm working on as a part of the Design, Technology, and Research Program, colloquially known as DTR, which is in turn part of the Delta Lab here at Northwestern University. So, quick 10-second version of the project. We're trying to understand how we can use smart reminder systems to help people build habits, specifically by sending reminders to complete very short actions in moments when it'd be easy for the user to do the action and that it'd be useful. For example, if you're trying to build a habit of drinking more water, reminding you to fill a water bottle before you head out to class. So in this video, I'll be covering a bunch of stuff. So everything that happened since the end of last spring, last video, in particular, including both this past fall quarter, but also all the work that I did over the summer as well. I think the agenda of this video will be a quick recap of last quarter's study, which is where we left off, a brief rundown on what happened this summer, rundown on the submission process of writing a paper, or the submission process of a paper, since that's a lot of what I'll be talking about, as well. And so we'll talk about the paper. So spoiler alert, we wrote a paper. Talk about findings from the paper, and then we'll talk about how the reviews we got and how writing the paper informed what we did this quarter and some of the high-level findings from our survey work this quarter. Cool. So first thing is a recap of last quarter's study. As you'll remember, we had an app that we ended up calling Dory, and Dory was this smart reminder system that used iBeacons to track people's locations. So we deployed that to 6 people. So the way that worked is we sat down with them, we had a meeting with each person, or I had a meeting with each person where they picked a habit they wanted to build, they broke it down into a couple micro actions, and then they associated a context with each of those actions, and that was a process that was essentially scaffolded by me, but so in that interview. And then we deployed the app to each of them for 1 month and interviewed them weekly. So got a lot of log data and a lot of interview recordings. Then this past summer, I spent a lot of time transcribing those interviews and organizing the quotes, organizing all the evidence we got from the interviews into findings, into like real findings, and starting to write an outline of a paper. So we were looking to submit to CHI 2018. So CHI is a Computer-Human Interaction. It's a conference. Deadline was in September, so we were writing most of it over the summer. So yeah, starting to write an outline of the paper. So brief rundown on how the paper process works, when I talk about it. So the first thing, you submit an abstract, and then about a week later you actually have to submit the full paper. That deadline was right the first day of classes, so this was pretty much all happening over the summer. Then a couple months later you get reviews back, and those reviews have scores with them, and they have a lot of questions. So the score gives you an idea of how the paper was received. The questions, you get an opportunity to respond to them in what's called a rebuttal, and that's a very short, like 5,000 character document you send back, and eventually get notified, and that's happening in 4 days. So unfortunately I'm making this video now. I'll be out of town at the time, so stay tuned. Yeah. So this past summer, and then the week right before classes, we were writing the paper. It was just revision after revision. And what was really cool about it, was really cool because it was first time I'd gotten to do research writing, which is really like real research writing, which was cool, and it really changed how we thought about our contributions and thought about our findings. Just like multiple times we went through a bunch of different cycles on what those were and what that meant. And I'll talk about the high level findings in a little bit. So we submitted the paper, then we got reviews back, and we took a look at the reviews, and they had a lot of questions, and I'll talk a little bit about how the rebuttal responses, or how the reviews influenced how we're thinking about the project now. But then we wrote the rebuttal, and that happened in the middle of the quarter, and we sent that out, waiting on notifications. So, without further ado, what are some of the findings that we had from last quarter that we wrote up in the paper? So I'll talk about 3 main categories of finding that we had, and some of the key takeaways from those. So the first thing is, we were really curious, does this idea of micro-reminding work? Can we get people to do actions by sending these reminders of very short actions in these like good moments? Does that get people to do stuff? And what we found was that Well, reminders of microactions that were sent in response to associated contextual cues reduce the cost of taking action to make progress towards a goal. And people did them, so that was really cool. So the cost went, like, they perceived them as pretty easy to do, which is what we were hoping for. Something that we thought was interesting that we saw was that the value of performing a microaction when you get a reminder, it's very tied to what are you about to be doing. So it's related to the relevance of that action to your future activities. So for example, if we remind you to fill a water bottle right before you go to class, that's useful. But if we remind you to fill a water bottle at night when you're going to bed, that's not useful, for example. So a couple takeaways from that. Microreminders are an effective conceptual strategy for helping people perform actions that make progress towards a goal. Does that by reducing the activation energy and the disruptive cost of taking actions while maintaining productivity. The other thing is that when you're, like I was saying, when you're scheduling a microreminder, it's important, obviously, to consider the immediate contextual cues in your environment to determine if you can, do the action in that moment. But it's also really important to think about, or to try and sense and take into account what are you about to be doing, what are your future activities, so that we can ensure that that action in that moment is beneficial. Second category of finding. Users performed microactions consistently over time, which was really cool. So one thing we also wanted to track is make sure that people were doing the actions not just like in a spike at the beginning, but consistently over time. And we saw that they were. In addition, we saw that they perceived their actions as easier and easier to complete as time went on. So a couple takeaways from that. The effectiveness of microreminders in encouraging users to take action towards a goal is consistent, and like I was saying, and it improves over time. And largely that was because as users became accustomed to their micro actions and the schedule, the plan, right, the contextual cues that they get those reminders in, or in response to, they become more dedicated to achieving their goal and performing the action. As they get accustomed to these things and they've seen the reminder a bunch of times, they are used to it. They feel a sense of ownership and dedication to it. In addition, they gained an intuitive sense of the amount of effort it would take to complete these actions, and once they had a good sense of that, it felt less difficult. So as time went on, these actions just felt less difficult. So third big takeaway, or third big set of findings, users' personalization of their micro-action plans. So in that meeting when we sat down, so their participation in that and their personalization of those plans contributed to a sense of ownership and increased dedication to their goal and their micro-actions. In addition, it was really important in the planning process. A lot of this thinking or this focus on personalization as an explicit design characteristic of Dory and of micro-reminders, the fact that users have to be involved in that planning process, that a lot of it came from the rebuttal work, because a lot of the reviews came back and they said, you talk a lot about micro-reminders, and you talk about, users were involved in the creation, but you don't discuss why that's important or how. We have findings, right? We had findings that people felt a sense of ownership and they felt more dedication, like I just said. But we didn't tie that back to personalization, and that's definitely the way we're thinking about it now. So the takeaway there is it's important to engage users in the goal setting and micro-action planning process because, one, they'll have a more intuitive sense of how their plan is helpful to them. So they were involved in this. They know why they should be doing this. They feel a sense of dedication to themselves and their goals that increases their motivation to take action when they get a reminder, because they're like, oh, I wrote this reminder, I should do this thing. And three, users have expert knowledge, right, of their own existing routines and of their preferences, which allows them to really form the most effective action plans to accomplish their goals and to avoid interrupting their other routines. So they're really the only ones, or maybe not the only ones, but they are the ones with the best knowledge to to break their goals down, to pick their goals and break those goals down into micro actions and associate each of those with the context. Those are like some of the really high-level findings that we had from last quarter and from writing the rebuttal process, and that's sort of the way we're thinking about the project right now. So then lastly, I want to talk about what we did this quarter, which was highly informed by the reviews. So coming out of writing the paper, we knew that the next thing we wanted to work on was that goal-setting interview. We wanted to make that not an interview, to try and understand that process a little better, and sort of subsequently to that, to build an interface through which people could do this goal setting and have it decomposition, like this decomposition to microaction, context association, that process all on their own, so that this could be sort of an end-to-end system. You don't need like a wizard sitting in the middle of it. And then when we got the reviews back, like I was saying, personalization was a big topic in those reviews, and thinking about like how does the fact that users were involved with that personalization process, how is that related to the design of Microreminders and to the design of Dory? So very much lining up there. So what did we do? Well, we tried to replicate that interview process in an interface, and what that ended up looking like was a Google Sheets with a bunch of prompts in it, and let me show you that now. Alright, so essentially what we did is we tried to, in a Google Sheet with a bunch of prompts, replicate the process we went through in those sit-down interviews. So what that ended up looking like was we wrote a bunch of prompts, and you can see sort of 3 sections talking about goals, micro-actions, and context triggers. For example, describe a small personal goal you have, then later brainstorm a couple of daily actions you could take in a minute or less to achieve that. Then later, describe a daily scenario in which those micro-actions would be easy and relevant. So very much the same process we went through with the interviews. Then in the next column, you'll notice we filled out, or I filled out all those prompts with one of the examples that we had from the actual study. So the one I keep coming back to, drink more water, because we had those as well in the interviews. And then what I used my status update this quarter, which was right at the end of the quarter. So I asked DTR to go through and fill the spreadsheet out, follow the prompts, and you can see all the little tabs at the bottom. So we have all of their responses to that, and we also had a survey. I had a survey that I asked everyone to fill out towards the end of the status update, and then we talked about it, and I got a lot of feedback. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about some of the high-level survey results that we got. Yeah, so to close out, I want to talk about some of the high-level results of the survey we ran after the status update. So one thing, people liked reflecting on their existing routines and thinking about how they could fit an action into them. A lot of the questions we asked in the spreadsheet were sort of along the lines of, so describe a scenario in which you could accomplish this action, but then digging a little bit deeper. So where are you? What are you doing? What were you just doing? What are you about to be doing? Trying to really understand, right, the holistic context of that scenario that the individual is describing. Also asking why that moment's, trying to get a better understanding of why people think about doing these actions in these different moments, and importantly also trying to understand what obstacles they have in doing that. So one thing that we heard is people struggled to think about those spaces in their routines when they had an irregular routine. So when they weren't sort of day-to-day the same. So one example of that being if they have a different bedtime, they go to bed at a different time, different days. If their action is sort of related to that bedtime process, it was harder for them to codify the context in that irregular routine. Another thing we heard a lot was that people struggled to identify goals, or having identified a goal, they struggled to design micro-actions of that goal. So a lot of what I heard is people wanted more scaffolding in terms of what kind of goal to choose and how to think about taking action. So some people said, well, the goal I chose didn't really seem to work with this, or the micro-actions I picked weren't applicable. They didn't work for this. In particular, people often felt like their micro-actions wouldn't be useful because those actions didn't target the real obstacles in terms of completing the goal. So if you said, I want to go to the gym more, that's my goal, and you're like, okay, well, an action I have is I could like pack a gym bag. Is that really the reason you don't go to the gym? The reason you go to the gym is probably not because you don't have your gym bag packed, potentially. So people were looking for more scaffolding in terms of that. So I think where to go from here, taking those survey results, using them to revise the prompts, or revise how we think about the prompts, think about what parts of the scaffold are missing. So obviously there's some pretty big parts of the scaffold missing. People have a lot of questions. And also coming up with alternate interfaces to service how people can set and break down those goals, right? Other than just sort of the sequential model of we've got a bunch of questions in a line, we ask you about your goal, your microactions, and your contexts, which is what we did in the interview. So what are alternate strategies that we can try, other interfaces that can let us do that and test those out. So that'll help us understand the obstacles in this like goal setting and habit breakdown process, which I think we're starting to do with the feedback we got, but there's definitely more work there. But also start to understand how to work around them. So now that if we know, for example, now that we need more scaffolding between or around choosing a goal and going from a goal to how do I think about what actions I should be doing. So we need more scaffolding there. Understanding how we can provide that scaffolding, how we can work around those obstacles. Yeah, so that's what I got. Hope you enjoyed the update, and I'll see you later.